Good evening, everybody. My name is Stephen Woolfolk. I'm the Director of Programming and Marketing for the Kansas City Public Library. And I'm excited to be a part of this event tonight in particular because it shares so much with the library's core mission. So if you don't mind, before we get started, I wanted to share a couple of library resources with you. First, you probably noticed as you walked in the Evicted exhibit in Kirk Hall. If you haven't already, I hope you'll spend some time there. The exhibit uses photographs, video storytelling, and spatial elements to explore the disruptive impact of eviction. Second of all, I hope that you will check out our new podcast, Anatomy of a Crisis. It's hosted by Kansas City Library Board of Trustees member Denisha Snell, and there are currently 7 episodes exploring the impact of racism on public health in America. And then finally, a few years prior to the pandemic, the library reorganized its community reference department, and they've been working to develop partnerships with organizations that can help with many of the situations that are in the book and that we'll be talking about tonight. First of all, we have KC Tenants. It's a grassroots organization that fights for tenants' rights. They've got a lot of fantastic resources if you or someone you know is facing eviction. The Heartland Center for Jobs and Freedom assists with housing issues, but also handles employment and consumer cases on behalf of low-wage workers and supports movements to improve wages and working conditions. Kansas City Gift provides grants to Black-owned businesses in Kansas City with a specific interest in businesses that operate in low-income areas. And KC Common Good is a clearinghouse of sorts that connects residents with resources they need to assist with addiction and mental health, education, employment, healthcare, legal troubles, or just general well-being. So all great organizations working alongside the Kansas City Public Library to better our city. I hope you will look into those. Our guest tonight is Dr. Michael Stein. He joins us to discuss his book, Broke: Patients Talk About Money with Their Doctor. He's a physician, health policy researcher, and thought leader in the field of public health. He currently serves as the chair and professor of health law, policy, and management at the Boston University School of Public Health. He's the author of 9 other books in addition to Broke, and his work has been published in the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and more than 400 scientific journals. Please welcome Dr. Michael Stein. So, Mike, can I call you Michael? I didn't ask you that beforehand.
Absolutely.
I wanted to start by asking you about the origin for this idea, not the book, but the origin for this notion that it was important for you to get into these topics with your patients. At what point in your career did you realize the importance of that?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's great to be in Kansas City, so I'm delighted to have had the chance to come out. I think, you know, I've been in medical school through academic institutions, which are typically set on the East Coast, which is where I'm from, in inner cities, typically in low-income neighborhoods. So it's not as if you can enter medicine in America and not pay attention to who's coming into your emergency rooms, hospital beds, clinics, etc. So I think probably very early on, I was aware of these issues. I trained really at the beginning of the HIV epidemic, so you can date me. And my interest always was HIV. It seemed clear to me from very early on. I was living in New York City when the first cases were, first patients were coming in and had no name for this illness. And I thought, well, this is interesting. This is going to be very interesting. And then it was clearly sort of the disease of my generation. And I thought, well, I should do that. And so when you did HIV again in the 80s and 90s, it was a time of great ostracism, great upset, populations that were marginalized to begin with, now with infectious disease that people didn't know about and understand. Interesting bookend now, of course, 40 years later, we're sort of at that point again. We could talk about that if we want to, but that's sort of been the bookends of my career. And so I was very involved with that population. But I have to say that talking about wealth issues, income issues, and everything around that, I don't think really sort of came into my mind until I was probably older and more secure. And had a little life under me, and then I began to have the conversations that in medicine are called social history, which is a traditional part of the medical interview. People would do a social history. And that over the years of medicine, since the last several hundred years, has been winnowed down, right? There's so much interest in so many other things that we can do for people and that are technological that the social history element has disappeared. So again, we can come back to that. But eventually I sort of realized, well, this seems to be an important thing. And then about 7 years ago, I moved to a public health school. I had always lived in the medical world, and then I moved to the public health world. And they're interestingly, in most medical programs, in separate buildings, often in separate parts of town, often not speaking to one another. They live in separate worlds. And at that point, as a person who bridged the two worlds, I had a chance to sort of bring some of the things that I was thinking and reading and writing about in a public health school back into my primary care practice. So I still, to this day, even though I'm a professor of health policy, I still see patients because I love seeing patients. So I guess that's the brief history of Michael Stein's consciousness raising.
I know a lot of us have probably been in situations where a doctor suggested a course of action and we ignored it because, you know, $750 for an MRI, you know, even if you're insured, that copay is going to be an obstacle for a lot of people. Do these conversations inform the way you are treating people?
Yeah, so I guess we'll take a step back and say, well, what are these conversations that I have with people? So let me step back and say, I continue to work in an inner city place. I actually now, since I'm a part-timer, I work, and I've always been a part-timer, but I'm a small part-timer at this point. I basically rent space from previous students of mine who have practices, and I work in their practices because they are nice enough to rent me space. And so I took old populations, old people that I have seen for many years, and moved them into these ritzier places, so they like that, and the patients enjoy that very much, and so it mixes things up. So the conversations really start to come from, I think, knowing people a little bit, right? You don't have a first conversation, as you can imagine. What would happen if you went into a new doctor's office and you had a sore throat or back pain or abdominal pain, and somebody starts talking to you about your income? Right? I mean, that's not going to happen, right? The first job of the doctor is to deal with the presentation and talk about the symptoms and try to offer relief and demonstrate competence around basic medical things. So I think these conversations about, you know, income and all of the parts of life other than income or that surround income happen once you get to know a person. So it's very hard to happen unless the presentation is such that it really is so evidently related to somebody's social conditions, which can happen. So the conversations come about really sort of through knowing people a little bit and then making some understanding of whether their social conditions relate to their immediate complaint. And then if you have more leisure as you get to know people over time, as I said, I'm a primary care person, which means that I get to see people over time in an outpatient setting for all sorts of reasons, often chronic reasons, then I can begin to understand the conversations a little bit more.
From a diagnostic standpoint, that makes sense. But from a treatment standpoint, as a doctor, you know what needs to be done, or you know what they should be doing. Does knowing what their financial situation is, does that hold you back at all in treatment and suggesting things that you know that they're not going to be able to afford?
Well, let me start on high and then come back around the other way. So I have this friend who runs a hospital, and she says, you know, we just had a patient come in. She was telling me the other day. She runs a hospital. She says, we just had a patient come in the other day, and this man, you know, tripped on a pothole, fell, broke his hip, came into the emergency room, got treated in the emergency room, got brought upstairs, got operated on, had hip surgery, costs $25,000. Sent home, you know, with continuing physical therapy, and an additional cost to that. And she turns to me and she says, well, who's going to fix the pothole? So it becomes the issue, right? So these things that end up in the medical system start often out in the world. And so these things people bring their worlds into my office. Now, how do I know that? Well, I can ask directly. Sometimes I learn indirectly when they come back and they say they didn't take their medication, right? That's a typical one where people say they didn't take their medication, or they took half their medication. Why did you take half your medication? That's all I could afford. And so then that begins to open up the conversation. So when there was direct bearing on their medical treatment around that, it comes up. Most of my patients, have medical insurance, but not all the time and not all the people. So with those people, when I'm quite aware that they have no medical coverage, it's an immediate issue. I often barter, like I live on the East Coast, so like if you bring me clams, I'll take care of you. So I'll barter with you. My office staff doesn't really love that, but I've had a lot of that. As long as I cover my costs, they say, fine, you can work here and take your clams. So I take my clams, and I have people bring me chickens and candles and other things, but most people have insurance. But insurance in America, as you all know, doesn't often cover your costs, right? So you have exorbitant copays, and that's what insurance is at this point. And so there are people who could be insured and can't tolerate the costs that they still have.
One of my biggest takeaways from the book is, as a middle-aged white man, I grew up in the most middle of middle-class families, and I'm still grappling with my own privilege in a lot of ways. But as I was reading this, it just kind of affirmed that privilege exists in a whole lot of places and a whole lot of forms. And I was feeling guilty reading a lot of these stories, and I kept wondering, how did you learn to live with that? You had to feel guilty too, listening to these people telling you some of these stories.
Yeah, I think so. I don't love talking about this book in terms of, I'm not here to make my readers or my audience into decent people. That's not my purpose particularly. It's, I'm a writer. I've written lots of books. I've written fiction, I've written nonfiction, and while I believe in sort of, moving people, one heart at a time, they have to be stories that interest you. They have to be stories that move you in some way. And so, what I wrote down were stories that moved me. Now, do I feel guilty? Doctors have a break, right, compared to many people. They feel naturally, and I think this is incorrect, but they feel naturally, and I think I have a part of this, that, what they do is virtuous, right? They're doing this virtuous thing, they're doing this good thing in the world, and they forget, well, they're actually paid pretty well to do this virtuous thing, but it's a nice thing to be able to help people. So a bit of the guilt is relieved by the fact that I'm feeling something virtuous, and that I'm actually taking care of people as best I can one at a time. And what you learn in public health, I think, and we could talk about this, is that your job as a physician, as a primary care physician or any other kind of physician, is the patient in front of you. That's your job. It's not a systemic job. So there is a systemic need for change, right? There are structural things that we can change as a society that address some of the issues that end up in doctors' offices. And I have very strong opinions about sort of the divide between public health and medicine. And it's a long way of saying that sometimes I feel guilty and sometimes I feel ashamed. But the truth is that low income or poor people are always at the mercy of people who have more money, right? Whether it's in a doctor's office or whether it's in their homes facing social issues that are controlled by or driven by politicians or other people. So, there is a sense of that. And the only way these things change in the end, so I'm glad you feel, it's a long way getting back to how you feel. I'm glad you feel, the things that can change sort of poverty, which is a very changeable thing, I think, in America. We've just proven it over the pandemic, are shame and anger. I mean, I think that's what changes these things. I don't think morally, but all the time, but I do think, and certainly not in my physician's office, but I do think that these are moral issues. And, we know that because, poverty is a central issue around religions. All religions speak about poverty. And so this is clearly a moral issue.
You write in your introduction, these are not stories of sickness or bodies, the usual subjects of a doctor's writing. I provide no diagnosis. I present these stories from a doctor's office because perhaps poverty should be approached from a public health perspective, as the moral perspective alone has failed us.
Yeah.
Can you step out of the doctor's office for a moment and into your current job on the policy side? What does it look like if we start to address poverty from a public health perspective?
Okay, now we're gonna get going. You ready? We're all ready. Okay. How many of you do soccer or have friends, family, or children who do soccer? Soccer's gotten big in America. Lots of people do soccer, right? Okay. Here's the metaphor. There are 11 people on a soccer team. For those of you who've never seen soccer, there's one goalie who protects the goal, and there are 10 players on the field. Okay? The healthcare system is the goalie. That is, you want a really good goalie when you're sick. You want somebody who will block the ball, block the illness from proceeding. But the game of soccer is played by the other 10 people. And in fact, you don't ever want to use the goalie, right? You're a winning team if you never get to the goalie. The goalie is the healthcare system. The 10 players on the field is public health. The game is played out in the field. It's fixing the pothole. It's fixing the stairs up and down to the house that somebody falls through the stairs on. It's the eviction exhibit you have downstairs. It's the fact that you have a park that's overrun that nobody can use. It's the fact that you drink from a well that's polluted. It's the fact that, you know, you're uneducated. That's what the difference is. So I love goalies. I want a good goalie. I am a goalie, but the game is played outside. And all the attention at moments is, well, did you have a good goalie? There's one goal. You won 1-0, but let's think of the other 10 players. So that's the metaphor that I think we need to think about for thinking about public health. And we could tell stories. You know, there's a great story that I love about an old blues player. I love old blues. An old blues player named Blind Willie Johnson. Blind Willie Johnson was from Houston. He was born sighted. At about 8 years old, he lost his sight in a domestic violence incident in his house. He grew up poor. He left his house at about 15. He became a blues player. He lived in poverty. He got married. He did well enough as a blues player. He developed malaria. This is in the 1930s. He developed malaria. He went to the hospital to be treated for treatable malaria. The hospital turned him away, and he died. They turned him away because they didn't treat black blues players in that particular Houston neighborhood. So the question for the audience is, what did Blind Willie Johnson die of?
Or race.
Well, he clearly died of malaria. Right? So now you start to throw in these other things, and you go, well, yeah, well, on the death certificate it says malaria, and for most of us, they would say, well, he died of a malaria statistic, but there are other things that drive health. It's like the pothole incidents. It's like the soccer field. We have to think of sort of these personal metaphors, and that's how I think of public health. Okay, what was your question, Steve?
You nailed it. You nailed it. I want to get into a few of the stories, and you said you wouldn't mind reading a couple of them, right, for us? If you don't mind, I'd like to start with the story Safe on page 43.
I have to take my glasses off because I'm old. 43. Want me to read the whole thing?
Yeah, if you don't mind. I know it's a big one.
Safe. So for those of you who've never picked up this book or seen this book, so what this book is about 100 and something number of one-page, basically monologues with me helping them along of patients that I've seen who have had some money issues. And I don't really give you their gender or what they look like, partly for confidentiality, but partly because it's irrelevant. And I don't generally tell you what their medical diagnosis is, but they're just speaking about things that we end up speaking about because Can I just, before I get to this, so what you find, and those of you out there will tell me about whether this is true, but what I find is that people who don't have a lot of money will talk to you about money. Like, it's on their mind. It's on their mind all the time, right? This notion of Americans don't like to talk about money. Well, poor Americans like to talk about money a lot. Rich Americans are, they're edgy. They'd rather, probably talk about sex than money. It's very hard for people who have a bunch of money to talk about money. So you end up, if you get to know people, talking about their money, about their child support payments, about the fact that they can't fix their transmission, about the fact that they're late because they couldn't do childcare, et cetera, et cetera. So you end up doing that. So these are conversations, sometimes 1 or 2 sentences, sometimes a whole page of conversations that I've had with people over the years. Okay, so that's what the book is. So if this seems sort of fragmented, it's because it's fragmented. I work 3 nights a week cleaning the local elementary school at $10.50 an hour. I can't go over 20 hours a week or I lose my Section 8 housing. So I take home about $189 a week, although last week I made $205. My housing is a 4-bedroom worth $950, but I don't have to pay a thing. My daughter, who's disabled, gets $733 a month from SSI and $160 in food stamps. I don't trust anyone with her. She's 6 and she still needs help potty training. She rips off her diapers all day and shits on the floor. You can't force her to do things. This is me now. How can you not be furious all the time even though she's your daughter? Autism with all your other burdens, but on her face is an expression that says only, this is what I have to put up with. She. I pay $100 for water, $63 electric, $74 gas, car insurance $76, cigarettes $240 a month, dog food $50, and I buy a rat a month for the snake. I spend $100 in gas because I just drive my daughter around all day rather than stay at home with her grunting and not talking and watching me. I need to get away. I bought a battery and alternator this month for $150. I buy my daughter wipes and special detergent. Those are expensive. So, these people, they know exactly what they spend, right? I mean, this is not a written down budget. She's not reading me off a piece of paper. This is like, I spend $74 on gas and $63 on electric. So it's interesting. They know their money.
Yeah. And there's another part to this, right?
Oh, there's more?
I think there's a... Oh, we got to get to the safe part.
Oh, well, I wait, watching her. How does she distract herself? Where's the girl's father, I wonder? Quote, my son wants me to waitress at the restaurant where he works because he thinks I'd make good money. But I tell him, the first person who tells me the food is cold, I'll throw it at them. I'm not ready to be around people. I'm not there yet. I'd rather clean the school on my own all night, even if I make less. I give $100 to him every month because he has a safe where he puts some away for my daughter. There's $3,500 there. I can't let the state see it, or they'll take her money or make me pay rent. But I need to know she'd be all right if something happened to me.
I think that's an important one to me for 2 reasons. One, it feeds into this, there's this idea out there in America that welfare is somehow a disincentive to work. And I feel like the truth is welfare isn't a disincentive to work. Taking the welfare away when people work, that's a disincentive to work. But it's a remarkable story of resilience that this woman with that tight of a budget cared enough about her daughter that she socked away $3,500. I mean, that's more savings than a lot of people that are probably in a much better financial situation than she has. Is that a common theme? I mean, these people, it's not bad decisions as a rule. These people really have it hard, and they're making the best of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sentimental. The book is not meant to be sentimental, as you can see. It's really sort of meant to just lay it out there. I mean, I think that people live, and it's heterogeneous, right? I mean, there are people who are very resilient in the book and who are absolutely, I admire so much. And there are people who I don't admire so much, and they just happen to be low income, right? I mean, they're people to people, and they're just heterogeneous. So, yes, she is a very resilient one, who I just saw the other day and is not doing well. So, these things don't end up often happily. And there are only so many things you can do for them, right, in a medical office. So I know that we were going to talk about that. But yes, resilience and admiration is, I think, a large part of the day, and makes me forget sometimes about my guilt and shame, just admiring people.
And I will say, you're detached as a doctor, and you've heard these stories. For me as a reader, this was a very emotional book.
I'm not detached as a doctor. Why do you make that assumption?
Well, you said that you didn't intend it to be an emotional book, and to me, reading it was very emotional.
No, I said I didn't want it to be a sentimental book.
Okay.
I want it to be an emotional book. It was very emotional to write, and these are things that I've... so it's emotional, yeah, and I think all doctors are, to some degree, we're trained into detachment from the very first day of medical school, and, the rest of your life you learn to be undetached. I mean, it starts in medical school on day one, and then you have to learn, if you're lucky as you get older, to reattach.
Okay. How about, there's another one on page 86 called Why. Can you take a look at that one for us?
What page?
Page 86.
I haven't read this book in a while, so I'm sorry. I don't really, I didn't even know that went onto a second page, so thank you for telling me. Why? A good friend of mine just killed himself. A guy I used to walk my dog with in the mornings. I'm sorry to hear it, I say. Tell me about him. 2 days ago, he didn't show up with his dog. His wife came over an hour or two later and asked, "You seen my husband?" I told her I hadn't, and the next day, I hear he hung himself in his garage. He was 60. He had a wife and a 9-year-old daughter. He seemed as happy as could be the last time I saw him. If anyone complained on that walk, it was me. He had a mutt like mine. I can't understand it. He didn't owe anyone a dime. So his understanding was, well, that's why you would commit suicide, is if you owed people money.
That last line haunted me, that this person couldn't even conceive of another reason why somebody would take their own life if they didn't owe any money.
Right.
And you spoke to this a moment ago, but to me it just kind of reiterates the idea that for some of these people, it's all about money, right? That is the beginning and the end of the story for them.
Well, it's at the beginning and the end of the story as I wrote their story. And of course, all the things that I wrote about had to have something about money in them. Obviously, people talk to me about things other than money, but I would say that, money, poverty is a feeling to people, right? I mean, we think of it sort of as a policy person. I can tell you, income thresholds for qualifying for Medicaid, right? There are dollar figures and numbers that I could put it at. But I think for people, poverty is a feeling, it's a feeling of invisibility and a feeling of disdain and often self-loathing. And it's a feeling that, that always carries with it a certain amount of stress. And, that stress is something that means that you're thinking about, that your bandwidth is really sort of narrowed, and you're thinking about money all the time. There's a well-known sort of psychological experiment that goes like this. So you go up to people on the Kansas City street. This was actually done in a mall in New Jersey, but it sounds better if we did it on the Kansas City street. So you go up to people and you hand them what's basically shape puzzles like you would get in an IQ test, right? So you would see 3 shapes and it would say fill in the 4th. Okay, so it doesn't require language, it doesn't require education, it just requires you to pay attention. So it's a kind of intelligence test. And you take some demographics on the people in this experiment, and the demographics include, where are you from, et cetera, lots of sort of questions that hide the true question, which is, your income. So then the researchers would divide people into sort of low and high income. And the experiment goes like this. You ask people randomly on the street, do you have $150 to pay for your car breaking down? And you spend a second talking to them about if they have $150, and then you give them the the puzzle test. And what you find out for about $150 is that low-income people and high-income people do about the same on this puzzle test, okay? And then you ask another set of people, you know, do you have $1,500 for when your car breaks down? And you talk to people about that. Now, $1,500 is a lot more than $150. Many people, although not all Americans, we could talk about that, have $150 but may not have $1,500 that they could get to. So the question is, you know, could you borrow it? Could you get it from somebody, et cetera? Now do the puzzle test. And what you find is a complete divergence. That is, the low-income people now start to fail the puzzle test. And the higher income people actually do about the same as those high-income people who were asked the $150 question. And it's because you start to get in your head like, oh, you know, you start thinking about, oh, I've got the interpretation by the researchers, you know, now the $1,500 is in my mind. Like, what would I do? Like, is that going to happen? Could that happen to me tomorrow, et cetera? And so it's very distracting. And I think poverty is that feeling of sort of stress and distraction. And that bandwidth and this notion that we can sort of, that we're cognitively fixed people, that we think the same about things in all sorts of situations just isn't true. And that's sort of evidence that when you provoke them and make them think about money at a high level, it's very disturbing and distracting to them. So I think people who don't have a lot of money think about it all the time and are distracted by not thinking about it.
Would you mind if I ask a follow-up question?
Actually, yes, but is this microphone on, Leslie? Sorry to throw you a curveball there, Leslie. I just want to make sure that everybody at home can hear the question as well.
Could I ask the follow-up question that not only the conclusion from the test was that people get in their mind, the people that don't have a lot of money, when now you've brought up the idea that what if tomorrow I have to come up with $1,500 and they're thinking to themselves, I wouldn't be able to do that, and then I think there's probably a spiral of then I couldn't get to work and I couldn't get my child to the school and those types of things. Is there also a component of that too that is the feeling of being judged by the person that's asking, and when you have to say, no, I don't have $1,500 for that, is there was there a component to that they mentioned, or is that just a...
No, because it was asked, you know, supposedly asked non-judgmentally, and it was really asked, so imagine this scenario, you know, if this were the case that you needed this for the car tomorrow, not, you know.
Not in a judgmental way.
It was not meant to be judgmental, no.
No. Thank you.
And you know, as many of these experiments are, it's a little bit disguised, right? It's sort of hidden within a bunch of other questions. That was one question, and then there might have been another question about, you know, where do you shop for groceries, or something that would distract the person. But that one lodges. The interpretation is that lodges in people's brains and reminds them, like, I don't have this tomorrow, and now what am I going to do?
This is probably a good time to remind anybody watching at home, if you have questions, feel free to drop those in the chat, and we'll get to those, as many of those as we can, a little bit later on. I'm going to do one more to read, if you don't mind. Page 84, the title is Marriage.
Marriage, okay. Between me and my husband, it's no good. That man gave me trouble all the years we've been married. He's 70 now and took over his father's body. He's his father's twin. He took his attitude too. I told him I want a separation, and this is his answer. Why the hell would you want to do that? You're old. How long are you gonna last? 5 years? I'm in better shape than you, I say. I got things to do. He says, you hate my guts. I never said that, I tell him. You still can't have any of my money, he says. Here are my reasons for leaving. Tell me, I say, although there'd be no stopping her, really. I never wanted to be in that house. His brother talked him into buying it, and I never liked it. It still needs fixing after 43 years. I never liked the kitchen. I wanted a single level that was finished, not a work in progress. The second reason is that my mother follows me around the house. She lived with us and died there in my arms, and now I constantly think about her and I want to get away from her. The third reason is that I want to get away from him. But when I ask for $5 for gas, he asks me why he should give it to me.
I know this wasn't the intention of the book, but one of the things that really stood out to me is, you hear stories about people that are trapped in bad relationships, and it's one thing to hear those as in secondhand stories that other people are telling you, but firsthand, that's a lot harder thing to deal with, hearing these firsthand accounts of people trapped in these relationships and the reasons why they can't escape. How does that play into the public health aspect as well?
In the public health aspect, I'm not sure,
Just bad household situations?
Well, bad household situations plays into everything in life, right? I mean, that's a hard thing for everybody involved. But, sometimes these people, these women particularly, they don't get to come in alone. That's when it's upsetting. It's in some ways liberating for her and a privilege for me to hear this story and explore this if she's open with her about, is she safe? Is she going to leave? How could she leave? Does she really want to leave after 43 years? What's that like? So you end up, if you have time, doing mental health care, which is really what I'm talking about here in these office settings. But there are lots of women who won't say this out loud or won't come in to the office alone because their husbands or partners won't let them. So in some ways that's worse. This felt like, to me, when I heard this, sort of a moment of liberation, like she was fed up, like she was ready to go. And yeah, she actually went.
I was going to ask if this was one of the ones you knew the...
Yeah, not this day, but over time, she and he split. Yeah, she went to live with a daughter, which was complicated in itself, but yeah.
I'm going to circle back to the stories because I want to finish by asking you about Perry. But first, I think we have to talk about COVID a little bit, right? And you addressed this in the afterword. But first of all, you mentioned telemedicine.
Yeah.
And I wonder, do you think telemedicine has any place in hoping to bridge this financial gap in the healthcare system?
I think it has a lot of places in the healthcare system, and I hope that it sticks around in lots of ways. It's already under pressure and retracting because it's America, for financial reasons and frankly not very good reasons. But yeah, I think it's going to last, and I think that it can be helpful in these situations a lot. I mean, I wrote the afterword during COVID because the book was coming out around then, and they said you should say something about COVID in the book because there's nothing about COVID. And so, I started to do telemedicine as a primary care person, and I got to go into their houses. Well, that was really something now I've done that over the years. I've gone to people's houses, but I don't do it regularly at this point. And so that was interesting for them to show me around, sometimes, quite proudly around places that you would not necessarily be proud of, offhand. And so that was interesting. A lot of people had great pride of ownership at home. Others, of course, were ashamed and stayed in their corner and wouldn't show you anything. But I do think that it allowed a continuation of care that was great. And now, it's interesting how it plays in now. So I got a call. I saw patients, what day is today? Thursday. So 6 days ago, I saw patients last Friday. And I had somebody, Joe, we'll call him Joe, on my schedule. And Joe's supposed to come in and see me. And all of a sudden the schedule flips and it says phone visit. So sometimes I do, real just telephone. Sometimes I actually Zoom or visualize where they are, phone visit. So I call up Joe. I say, Joe, what is this? Why are you not here? And he said, and this is honest and it speaks to the book. He said, listen, your office is 45 miles from my house. And, I have a truck now. I got a truck. The truck gets, 10 miles a gallon. So that's like 4 gallons, and it's $5 a gallon. It's $20 to see you, $20 to get back. It's $40. He said, that's a phone visit. And I said, oh, so you just wanted to save $40? And I said, thank you for telling me. That's super honest. Like, let's do the phone visit. Like, I get it. So a lot of people will now play the gas card. And I do think that this is a real thing. Like, there are these marginal people now, and this is a real thing, this gas price, $4 to $6. I was in California yesterday, and it was, $7 a gallon in Los Angeles. And, that's the difference between sort of being on the margin over the margin and being pulled back into the really sort of unaffordable daily life thing is $7 a gallon gas. And so he just—
Assuming you have a car.
Assuming you had a car. And so he just, called it out. He said, you're $40 in gas for me. I'm not doing that. Let's just talk. So that was interesting. So.
Along those lines, you talked with some of your patients about the stimulus checks.
Yeah.
Did you, I'm hoping the answer is yes, any evidence that those payments were having any kind of a substantial health impact?
Okay, listen, stimulus checks. Let's talk about this as a public health, and then we'll get back to this if we're coming near the end. So I'll go on my soapbox here. Listen, 1 in 6 children in America live in poverty. I mean, that's a stunning statistic. Do you understand how different that is from any other place in the developed world? In the high-income countries, 1 in 6. It's a completely fixable problem, right? So what you saw during the pandemic was an influx of a tremendous amount of money. We can argue whether it's too much or too little from a sort of macroeconomic view, but what happened during the pandemic, which is already sort of reversing, was the most incredible reversal of poverty in America in 60 years. So we look at this pandemic as a disaster for the country. 1 million people dead, lots of people unemployed. There was this influx of money that went to low-income people. And poverty in children, went down by 2/3 in America. And the stimulus checks, changed poverty. 25 to 35 million people in America were no longer in poverty during the pandemic. So there's a strange thing that happened that people don't understand. The pandemic, right, is a disaster. Well, of course, poor people suffered more deaths disproportionately from high-income people, but they also, those who weren't dying of COVID, were doing better financially for the first time in 50 years. So that's the strange thing that happened that nobody talks about during this. So poverty in America, if you throw the money at it, and we could talk about how to do that over long periods of time, is reversible. And if you just think about it in terms of children, which is, always gets you out of this problem of, well, the poor are undeserving because they don't work hard. Well, I don't happen to believe that there are 45 million Americans who don't work hard. That's how many people are in poverty. Like, really? 45 million people, you're gonna say they don't work hard? So there's something structurally problematic with the United States, but we prove that it's reversible. And so the question is, as a country, do we wanna reverse it? That's a policy decision. So that's not a medical primary care provider, but we should understand the numbers, right? 60% of Americans will be in poverty at some time before they're 65 years old. 60% of Americans. That's incredible, right? That's incredible. Right? I mean, but the disproportion that we live in this country at the moment, right? The 17 cabinet officials have a net worth of more than 43 million, the bottom 43 million Americans. I mean, the disproportion that we happen to have exacerbated at this point is just sort of shocking, and we just have to decide. And now, because of this pandemic disaster, we've actually proven that poverty in 2020 is nearly completely reversible. Wow. So think about that. But it means a lot. It means you being taxed more. That's what it will mean over the long run, me being taxed more. That's the only answer to this. Do we want to do that as a country? I don't know. They do it in 26 other developed countries. So I think these gets back to the sort of moral decision. They're policy decisions, and they're decisions that happen outside of my primary care office.
Did you identify health impacts? I know you don't necessarily visit with people regularly enough to assess that on a grand scale, but did you see instances where people were able to better care for themselves and showed improvements in their health?
You mean because of stimulus
But because
checks?
of the stimulus checks?
Well, certainly in terms of their mental health, it was dramatic. You know, I don't know about their physical health or they're taking medications or something like that. I can't remember specific incidents, but you know, the stress relief of having an extra $600, you know, per week is really dramatic for people. And you know, it was the first time they ever had savings and other things that, you know, now you see drives inflation because it's overstimulated the economy. A lot of this money is now coming back into the economy. So there are long-term effects that we couldn't have necessarily seen, but I do think that it meant a lot to a lot of my patients, for sure.
Before we go to audience questions, I want to ask you about Perry, because most of the people in the book, they're kind of one-off stories.
Yeah.
Perry kind of gets his own treatment throughout, and I wondered, first of all, what was it about Perry that warranted that extra?
Okay, so first of all, when you write a book that's all fragmented, you want a reader to be able to carry some line through the book, right? So I write novels, you need to be able to follow a character. That's what keeps you interested in the book. So I needed one character. It's Perry. Perry's the only person, as you heard, all of these were called Y and whatever their titles were, but Perry's called Perry. So there's only one character who's named in the book. Okay, so Perry had a writerly function. So I had to find somebody, and I could have chosen several characters. Perry was just a super interesting person to me. He was resilient. He was a sort of ex-Marine boxer, beaten up as a kid, went into the military, beaten up by his father as a kid, became a champion boxer, comes out, had lots of real health problems, worked for some part of his life, and then, you know, I saw him later in life, and just the ups and downs. He had this marginal existence that he enjoyed very much. He was in general, a sort of positive soul, and he had these experiences that sort of changed up and down, including falling in love and other things that happened during, you know, a few years that I followed him. But it was just that he was always on the margin, and he got involved, fell in love with a woman who was interested in money and had ways of playing with money in ways that interested him. So I thought he was a good bridging story.
He was an interesting case because, like everybody else, he had his own financial troubles, but he was helping his neighbors, right? I mean, this is a guy that was bragging about the fact that when everybody else is out of money, I'm giving them sandwiches.
Right. He saved his money. People got their money, you know, they would get their paycheck, and he knew exactly, you know, when apartment 7D was going to run out of their money, and would show up at his house, at his door, knock on the door and say, "You got any pizza left?" You know, it'd be like the end of the month, and Perry would save pizza because 7D would knock on his door and say, "You got it." And so he would, you know, this was a great thing to him. This was very meaningful. It made his life feel good to be able to help these people who were not doing even as well as he.
And I remember in the book at one point he says something to the effect of, "Yeah, I know why you're here. I saw dominoes at your door for the last 14 days." Well, if there are any audience questions, please step up to the microphone so the folks at home can hear as well as we can here in the room.
First of all, thank you for coming and talking about this subject. It's a lot of things that people don't like to talk about because it does make them uncomfortable. And I wanted to mention when they ask about, well, what changes could it make in the person's life with the stimulus? My daughter's boyfriend, he took his stimulus money and he got certified. He went through this technical course, took a long time, was very difficult, but he has his first professional job with benefits, which he's never, ever had before. And so, I mean, this stimulus did not only affect what was going on at that time, obviously it will affect the rest of his life. So let me ask you something. When you deal with the wide variety and assortment of people that you see and they come to you with medical problems, is there sometimes that you feel that they shouldn't be really talking to you, that maybe there's something behind their medical problem, that they really need another resource that would be able to help them with it? And how do you say it to the person? And do people sometimes feel that if you are talking to them this way, then you're trying to get rid of them as opposed to, really helping them get to the root of the problem?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your question. Well, I certainly don't mean to think that or express that I'm like a one-person show, right? I mean, there's lots of people who need to help. And so I talk about some things with them, and I'm interested in some things, and I can't get them a house, and I can't, pay their rent check for them. And people understand this. There are very few people ever in my life, in my medical life, who've asked me for money, which is interesting, because I've had many people say, well, you make a lot of money, you're so-and-so, but they don't ask for money. So they need services, and there are real things there are real places to go. You broadcasted right at the beginning of the talk. You put up, community-based organizations that can help people. So part of my job, or the job of my office staff, has to be to know where to send people for help. So, yeah, I'm not going to hear all of the problems. I'm not going to know all the problems, and I'm certainly not going to be able to fix all the problems. So I send them in lots of ways. The question is, should doctors be doing that at all? We're at this moment in time where there is, interestingly, sort of this trend for doctors, hospitals, health service organizations to ask questions about social history and home life again. It's come back now, often because hospitals are the only players in town with a lot of money anymore, and they have ways to sort of organize this. And it's not selfless, because often people who don't have a lot of money become very expensive to hospital systems. So they have reasons, their own selfish reasons to ask. But it's now current in many hospitals around the country to ask 5 or 6 questions about, do you have a place to live, and do you have, et cetera, and what they do with that information, and whether that's effective in sort of helping people in the community, and the hospitals bridging with community organizations, I think is sort of an interesting research question. We don't know the answer to that, but now healthcare organizations are taking on these issues more than they ever have. So.
Laura?
I want to make sure that I circle this to a question, just some comments that I made as I was reading the book. I read it in a 1 or 2 hour stint because I was intrigued from the beginning through the end. And I kind of had prepared myself that I felt that I would be very emotional, like as you referred to, sentimental, emotional about it. Because my initial impression was that the book was going to be about, I'm broke because I need medical care and I can't afford, and I think that's a whole nother probably encyclopedia of books or series of books. And I felt like I prepared myself that I was going to cry, that I was going to read stories. A story I read during the COVID pandemic was a gentleman who behind the CVS counter who the mother needed 2 medications, cough medicine for children, and couldn't afford one, and she thought it was on sale and it wasn't, and he was very frustrated because he knew that her child needed that medication, and he risked his job and slid the medication into the bag with the receipt that she paid for one, and how that upset me to see. I think it's the fragility of all of these people's situations. But I noticed that, and you mentioned this, even though they focus on money, to them, this is the norm for them. For me to read and to think, oh my gosh, what if I couldn't put a new transmission in my car that I needed tomorrow? I don't have those concerns. They're concerned about that all the time, so that becomes their norm. And it was very interested to hear you say that in that sense that you have to kind of separate yourself from what you can do and what you can't do. And I wonder, just kind of, do you get a helpless feeling? I work with social workers, and I talk to them about, do you get that helpless feeling? They have 6 problems, and you can't answer all 6 of those. You can help their problems from the medical standpoint, but do you get that feeling of helplessness? Or, again, do you define that strength from the fact that they're resilient, as you indicated?
Well, there's a lot of parts to that.
There's a lot more questions, but I wanted to just make those points.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. First of all, I just want to say, and I said before that people are heterogeneous. not everybody wants more money. You know, they want a little bit more maybe, but they don't necessarily talk in those terms. And people don't come into my office all saying, I have no money, I'm miserable. There are lots of other pleasures in life, right? They love their kids, they love the work they're doing, they love their spouses. You know, there are lots of pleasures. These are not all people who just walk in miserable and say, I'm poor, you know, here's my hand. So, you know, the interaction is sometimes creates a feeling of helplessness. But, you know, you get that feeling as a doctor often because, you know, you're trained to, you know, take care and cure everything, and you don't know everything. You don't know the diagnosis sometimes. Sometimes you don't have a treatment that works. There's lots of helplessness in being a care provider of any kind. You just can't help everybody every time they come in, whether or not you're talking about money. I mean, there are lots of other things that you're helpless. So yes, I feel helpless all the time, not only with these patients talking about these issues, but you know, I also have to tell myself it's a long game, right? I can't solve this, but maybe we can look at this a little bit differently. Maybe the conversation is the first time they've ever had a conversation about this, and it leads here and there. So I see it as a long game, you know, which is what primary care is in a certain way if you're lucky. And I also think you're just hearing from me, like I'm sure I've done 1,000 things wrong and I've made mistakes and I've said things that, you know, embarrassed people or that I didn't quite get it right. So I'm also sort of humble about, you know, these are stories that I happen to write down and I'm lucky enough to sit here with you. But if you asked my 40 patients to tell these stories, they might tell them quite differently and be disappointed in me in lots of ways. So I don't know if that's an answer.
We have one more over here, and then I'll finish with an online question.
It's a two-part question, but I'll get right to it. So thanks, Dr. Stein, for being here. I just wrote it down. It sounds like from your perspective, and these are more, to use your soccer analogy, these are more goalkeeper questions than midfielder or striker questions, but I'll ask it anyway.
Okay.
It sounds like from your perspective, that frontline primary care medicine has to involve addressing and acknowledging psychosocial issues and socioeconomic issues, even more so than seeing a patient queue 15 minutes, 4 patients an hour. That's not enough time to really dig into that. What systems and in other countries are models that the U.S. can emulate? I mean, something in Scandinavia, does that jump out at you? What would you think?
Okay, let's go back to the assumption there. And I don't do private practice, and I have a salary. Those of you who do private practice and pay for office staffs, et cetera, may disagree with me. But the assumption that we have to do 15-minute visits, who said? Right? You can make a determination to do 20-minute visits and make a little less money. So that's up to you. That's on you. I mean, we live in systems, right? We live in larger healthcare systems now that try to book you every 15 minutes. Well, what happens if you say no? Or what happens if 4 of you say no? Are you fired? That's an interesting question, and you have to make that decision about where you're going to work. So I don't buy the 15-minute rule, and I've actually written about this. I don't buy the 15-minute rule. I also think that having lived in a system that books me every 15 minutes, we all know that there are some patients who you can see in 3 minutes, which means you have 27 minutes for the next patient. And so you do look at your schedule and think about, how do I shift this around so that I'm not here till midnight, but the people who need a little extra care do it. So I'm breaking with your assumption of the 15 minutes rule, because it's just a figment of our imagination. I don't know whether they have 15-minute visits in the National Health Service in England or any of those other places. But I do know that they have, greater income equality. And so let's just, again, can I just spend 1 second, can I have 1 more second? Okay. The county in the United States that has the lowest median income, here's a good stat for you. I don't do so many stats, but I like this one. Is in South Dakota. Median income of the county is $27,000. The life expectancy of people born in that county is 66 years old. The median income of a top 10 county in the United States, let's say Fairfax, Virginia, it's about $135,000. The life expectancy of a person born in Fairfax County is 84 years old. So we live in a country that has an 18-year life expectancy difference based solely on income. Okay, So again, these are addressable problems, and we have to decide, what we're going to do about them. Did I answer?
Yeah.
So I'm not going to go to Scandinavia. I'm just going to tell you the difference between our high income play out in.
It's right here. Okay.
It's right here, and it's what I call health. It's the 10 players on the field, right? That are the difference between 66 years old and 84 years old. It's not because they have better health care. When they're 66 and they're about to die, you'd like them to have good health care, but they would have gotten to 86 if they'd had a situation, life conditions in general, that didn't lead to all the complications, right? Obesity is a social problem. It's not that people overeat in America. I mean, they overeat, but why do they overeat in many cases? Well, look at the structure that we have. And so we could talk about this. And this is what my next book is about. So my next book for this summer, that's coming out this summer, is called Me versus Us, which is me being our attention to medicine and individual things, for which Americans spend $11,000 per person across America, several trillion dollar industry called healthcare, versus us, which is my shorthand for public health, where Americans spend $286 per person. 11,000, 286. 84 years in Fairfax, 66 years in South Dakota. So these things, I think, are very connected.
Okay. Very briefly, given that insurers are focused on medical loss ratios and episodic treatment rather than a life cycle approach,
Yeah.
and I don't think it'll ever happen, unfortunately, but I'll ask, what is your perspective on a more egalitarian single-payer system? I know more of a goalkeeper question, but I wanted to just get your thoughts on that.
Am I a single-payer person?
Before you answer that
so
question,
hard.
can I jump in with
That's
this
too
online
hard.
question? Because I think they're going to play into each other.
Okay.
You're going to have to put on your policy hat and maybe get your soapbox back out here. But so somebody watching at home writes, I find people are either in a poverty trap or many of the programs that would help them only exist on paper. My question would be, while bureaucracy and access to programs are a problem, isn't the lack of a single-payer health care and a social safety net the real issue here?
Well, I would say it's part of the issue. So if you ask me what are the 10 reasons why there's an 84-66 gap, I would say that certainly access to health care represents 20% of that. So don't get me wrong, I think that having should everybody have health care in America? Come on. Listen, you've been listening to me for an hour. Of course everybody should have health care. Whether it's a single payer or not is a longer argument, but that we don't have universal health care is just inefficient, and it just costs us all so much more money. So it's a problem that we don't have. But I don't believe it's the primary driver of life expectancy, having health care. I mean, what we know about American health care is until you're 80 years old, you'd rather live in Norway. And that once you're 80 years old, you want to live in America because we have the best care for 80-year-olds. We give them really good care. We have the best ICUs. We have the best cardiac care. There is no country in the world who technologically is better than us. We are the best. There are problems with it, but I want to be 80 in this country. The question is, do you get to live to be 80 when you're surrounded by everything else, and particularly if you don't have a high income, right? I mean, there you go. And a lot of it's luck. But I would say that universal health care is an absolute yes, and it would explain 20% of the problem here. It's not most of the problem.
Dr. Stein, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really enjoyed the book. Looking forward to having you back again for your next one.